We're going to pull up our next guest now. They're in here twice, so I'm going to hopefully pull up the correct one. Artosis, you're on the air. We can hear you. Can you hear us?
You can hear me?
Sure can.
Cool. Yeah,
All
so
right.
my question was just how do we objectively ground the NAP? Because a lot of times when I ask this, I feel like it seems like a subjective grounding. So I'm just curious how we get to the objective.
Well, I think that this, with Zulu being an objectivist, I think he's a little bit more prepared to answer that question as it's asked. But before he starts, I just want to say that for me, I wouldn't say that for me, the NAP isn't objective in an absolute sense. For me, rather, it's an objective relationship to certain presuppositions. But Zulu is the actual, completely bona fide objectivist. So I'm going to pass the baton to him.
Sure. So there are a few ways you can go about this. It's basically, if you want to talk about the NEP, you talk about, well, where do we get that first of all? Like, how do we arrive inductively at the NEP, and then how do we show that, well, we couldn't have possibly made a mistake here, because if you just imagine the alternatives to the NEP, it leads to lunacy. So, like, inductively, you would start by going, well, okay, there is this thing called scarcity. It is in fact the case that either that if I pick up some scarce resource in nature and then I want to use it for one thing, that this excludes a whole bunch of other uses of that thing. And that if you're to try and engage in one of those uses, well, then we're in this thing called a conflict, right? That kind of sets the stage for law as far as ANCAP see it. Now, our answer is the first comer principle. It's saying, which is just the same thing as the NEP, it's that the latecomer, the guy who came in second and started this conflict, initiated this conflict, which is what we call aggression, that he was in the wrong, that the first comer is the one who should be allowed to use that thing. Now, this is a prerequisite, first of all, for any sort of production to take place. If you have a latecomer principle that by accumulating resources that you are not entitled to those resources, well, then you could never engage in production if we took that out as a principle. And then we can just come along and take the fruits of your labor, as it were. That undercuts your means of survival, which is using your mind and applying it to reality. To alter reality, that's what production means. To alter reality to be more suitable for you. That's sort of how we can get to the first comer, why the first comer is better. But then you can also take it a step further. You can go, okay, and this is what Kinsella does. You can go, okay, well, let's imagine a conflict. We need A and B over some stick, right? Kinsella contends, and I agree with him, that both A and B, they have to make a certain presumption. They have to presume that ownership is distinct to possession. Now, this doesn't seem very important, but it actually is. So A would have to assume that ownership is distinct to possession, because let's say he got the stick first, right? He's saying that, well, yeah, even if somebody was able to take this stick from me, I'm still trying to use that thing. That's why it's a conflict. I'm still trying to use that thing. So even if it is wrestled off me, I still own that thing. These are distinct concepts in A's mind. So, okay. What about B? Well, B's also saying, because he's trying to use the thing, that, well, if somebody were able to take this from me, that's why it would be a conflict. If A is to win this conflict, I still have the right to it. I still own it, which is why he's trying to take it in the first place. So he has to assume that ownership and possession are distinct. But the latecomer, B in this case, he also has to presume that possession is the same as ownership. That by just taking something from A, that therefore gives him the right to keep it. Right? So he has to assume both that ownership is distinct to possession and that ownership and possession are not distinct. So any latecomer, you can just regress this out, would be in this contradiction. I can go on. My third way, I assume you're aware, is my e contrario, where the alternatives to the NEP are jungle ethics or mixed law. Both of them descend into the primacy of consciousness very briefly, and primacy of consciousness is false. I think all of these are basically pointing at the exact same fact that the NEP is in fact objectively true, and that's how I would go about objectively grounding it.
Yeah, I want to say thank you. You give a very clear explanation, so I really appreciate that about you. I just have a few more confusions though, because I don't see where the objectivity is coming. So I would take objectivity to be something like stance independent, and irrespective of the perspective of the person saying it, right? So you're grounding this in like a rational like principle, I guess, but we're not getting any normativity from that, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, let's take a question here, a line of questioning. Is it objectively true that Prince Harry is married to Meghan Markle? I don't know if let's assume that they are still married. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they are.
Okay, so would it be objectively true that they are indeed married?
Yeah.
But
We can empirically validate that, yeah.
Okay, would that be stance independently true?
Yeah.
I mean, does it not depend upon their stance that they're indeed engaged in that relationship?
Oh, I'm just so when I say stance independent, it means like any observer could deduce it using a reliable method, basically.
Deduce or induce, presumably.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was using deduce in the loose sense.
Okay, so let's say validate then. That they could, any observer could potentially validate this using, proper methods of epistemology.
Exactly.
So I don't see that I'm going away from that. I'm not saying like, well, based on some like opinion in my mind, this is true. Like, I don't think I introduced that like premise into my setup there.
I think so. I'm reading your thing. First comer principle required for production. So you're saying that if we're going to make a rational principle for how to deal with conflict, this would be the only one that doesn't fall into some kind of contradiction, right? Yeah. So then my follow up is like, well, how are we crossing that descriptive sentiment to the prescriptive? We ought to follow it. That's where I'm saying the stance of dependence would be failing.
Well, so I don't really see much of an issue with going between is and ought. Like, it strikes me that I did show that this is actually what is required for human survival, and that all these other possible ethics you could come up with, they are in fact self-contradictions. So that gives you only one possibility remaining, right? I don't see the problem with e contrario in this case.
Oh, I'm going to grant you the descriptive case, just for the sake of the argument. I'm just wondering, so how do we get the prescriptivity as objective?
Well, through the descriptive case. I built it up from the descriptive case into, well, this is your only option for a rational ethic. Now, presumably, we're not going to go down the line of, actually, I want to be irrational, I want to be wrong. I mean, are you going to go down that road?
I'm not going to go down that route. I'm actually just curious because I actually find a lot of the stuff you say kind of fascinating because you have like this really interesting take on objectivist metaphysics, and I'm kind of curious how you solve this like Hume guillotine problem.
Well, here, can I jump in there for a second and offer so if I have I want to make a presupposition here or an assumption. Let's say that we assume that there's a nail that we want to drive into the wall. And we also have two tools at our disposal. One of them is our bare hands, and the other one is a hammer. Is there a framework in there that we can make a prescriptive statement that's objectively true? Like, given that we want to do these things, it's objectively the case that we're better off using the hammer than the alternative?
I wouldn't say that we do have a framework for that because when you try to cash out the statement, I want something sharp, therefore I should use a knife. The should part, what I'm taking that to be is a second descriptive statement. So you're actually not introducing normativity here. You're just saying the knife satisfies the criteria.
So what would proper normativity look like in your view?
You have to go from the descriptive statement to some sort of duty that is or obligation imposed on the party.
Where would such an obligation come from? Like what would be a valid source of such an obligation?
See, I don't believe there is one.
So if I understand correctly, you're just saying that you don't believe that there are such thing as prescriptive statements? Like not that they can't be made, but they can't be valid?
Yeah, I don't think that there would be any objective grounding for them. Now, if the person has the motivation to follow the prescriptive statement, I would say it would be valid in that case, but it's not an objective criteria.
Okay. So if we have this, so if I'm understanding you correctly, there's a sort of an outright rejection of. Am I characterizing you correctly as like you're rejecting prescriptive statements in the sense that what are believed to be prescriptive statements are actually just descriptive statements still?
Yeah, the norm they don't carry objective normativity.
Okay, but they can be correct still in the sense that with the hammer example, it is descriptively the case that the hammer is superior to using my hands to drive the nail.
So superior, you're adding back in more normativity, right? So if you're just saying that the hammer is harder, that's fine. But it satisfies the criteria that you gave in the antecedent of your conditional. But if you're saying that it's superior in a normative sense, in that there's some duty or obligation imposed on the person, then I would say you don't have that in your premise.
Okay, so it satisfies the criteria objectively. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you give X criteria, you're giving like some physical condition, and then you're saying in the consequent of the conditional that the hammer or the knife satisfies that criteria.
Okay. And I'm not trying to box you in here. I'm trying to genuinely understand. So if that relationship, like let's say, for example, I'm going to just, and solely for the purpose of expediting the conversation, let's say I want this hammer to be nailed in within a certain amount of time, and there's just no conceivable way I can get it in within that time unless I use the hammer. If my hands are just, even if I beat myself to a pulp, I just can't get that nail in within that time frame. So there's an objectivity, like what you would consider a valid claim to objectivity of both the descriptive statement, and that descriptive statement is talking about how something satisfies this criteria objectively.
Yeah, so I'm fine with conceding the descriptive part because that part like is less interesting to me. I think people have been over it for so long. What I'm more concerned about is where the obligation is to use the hammer or to follow the NAP. Where does that come from?
Absolutely. I'm completely invested in answering that question the best I can. I just want to make sure that I got all the language cleared up before I do that, or else I'm probably working in vain. So that just these descriptive statements, and I hear you what you're saying about not being interested in them, but the extent to which they satisfy the criteria is objectively true.
Yeah, as long as if you're giving like a criteria and then you're saying that this has the properties that you're looking for, I'm fine with that.
Okay, so why is it then not valid for us to have the criteria that Zulu laid out in his explanation of the NAP, and to show that what he's talking about there, the course of action that he's, I'm sneaking in the word prescribing, but I just don't have enough brain power to come up with another word at the top of the head. But these suggestions, these recommendations, I guess, just to avoid sneaking in the word prescription again, the recommendations, is it not the case that it can be an objectively true descriptive statement that shows that what he's recommending satisfies the criteria that are set out? And then the claim, just to add the context into why that would matter from our point of view, is that the criteria that we're setting out, we would argue apply to most reasonable people. Like, for example, with Zulu, I'm sure, like, he would say one of the criteria is you have to be somebody who's interested in using reason. So somebody who rejects contradictions or those kinds of things.
So now you've kind of conceded what I was saying. So you made it a subjective, right? So you're saying if you have the motivation to be reasonable, this would be a. So your justification theory now is internalism, not externalism.
Well, and I don't want to. I'm not trying to contradict Zulu here or make even too strong of a point. I just want to make sure I understand. But let's say that you're. So I would call myself a subjectivist anyhow. So you're gonna get it. Either you're getting it from both sides here with me and Zulu, or both, or you're showing that both sides are blunted. But
I don't have a problem with NAP as a subjective grounding. By the way, I don't have any issue with that.
Sure. Well, okay, because what would matter to me the most, and I'm gonna let Zulu jump back in here just to confirm this in a second, but the thing to me about this that's so like important and interesting would be to say that yes, the NAP is subjective in the sense that you mean, but these assumptions that we need to make, the recommendation that we're making is an objectively valid descriptive statement about how that recommendation satisfies the criteria objectively. And those criteria, let's say it's true that the fact that there's criteria at all renders this a subjective statement, but the relationship between believing in the laws of logic and living in a world where there's scarcity doesn't lead any, like, objectively, as long as those criteria are met, it is objectively the case that you have to, like, those recommendations are the only thing that follows.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that response. I think it was very clear. I just think that my main issue here is the claiming that this is an objective standard, and if we're not claiming that, I wouldn't take issue with the claim, because I think Hume's whole idea is that when we're doing like a deduction from a principle, right, the conclusion of the principle cannot contain anything that's not contained in any of the premises. But when we're making these premises about practical conditionals, we're introducing the prescriptivity that's not contained in any of the premises. So I think that's going to be the issue. So we don't have a tautological completeness in our argument.
Sure. Well, it seems to me then that we've come to an agreement that these are subjective values, but the recommendations that we're reaching are objectively valid descriptive statements about what comes from those, if you accept them. So the question is just then, so it's objectively true for those who have those values that these recommendations are what necessarily follows. And the question for me is, well, okay, what are these presuppositions? Like, for example, the presupposition of the Islamic faith versus the Christian faith. I mean, obviously the world is divided up such that there are many, there's lots of different people from both sides. And you could really conceivably see any individual going either way. But our presuppositions are adherence to the laws of thought, so, non-contradiction, and accepting that we live in a world that contains scarcity and other people. So I'm not so sure. Like, to me, it's such a empowering way to describe our position, to say, yes, it's subjectively true. It's objectively true if you hold those standards, I mean, but also those standards are like that logic is valid. So wouldn't that be wouldn't that be a good thing for us?
Yeah, if I would concede the NAP was a descriptive fact, it would be good for you. But I'm wondering, does Zulu agree that it's subjective as well?
So yeah, sure. I could jump back in here because I've been taking some notes. I think it's a perfectly fine way to think about it in Galazar's way, where these are somewhat like, inescapable recommendations, you could say. That, well, if you accept things, crazy things like that the laws of logic are valid and that you should be rational and so on and so forth, it's you got to accept these prescriptions, right? Which, there are some philosophers who would reject those things.
Yeah.
Put those guys aside for now. I want to get kind of, there's sort of two things that I want to get into here. I think probably the best thing first was you were talking about Hume's guillotine there.
Yeah.
That I'm, basically defeated by Hume's guillotine in some way, or that I haven't addressed it.
Only if the claim is that the prescriptivity is objective as well.
Yeah.
That's my claim.
I would say that I'm making objective prescriptions here, and I'll real quick go over why I don't think Hume's guillotine stands as a valid counter to that. I think it is fundamentally a self-refuting statement. If you look at what Hume is saying, well, he's saying that, well, you should only believe in this thing and that thing, something which you can see with your eyes, or that you maybe you hear it from like a reliable person, giving a very vague treatment to Hume here, of course. He's got certain epistemic norms, and these are saying, well, this is how you should choose to operate your mind. These are the ideas you should accept, and how you should go about validating and integrating these things. Now, it strikes me that in his statement, where kind of the bottom line of it, the upshot of it, is that there are no valid ought statements, he's making himself a bunch of ought statements. His whole claim is an ought statement. It's about what you should or should not accept. I shouldn't accept that there are valid ought statements. Okay, well, is that not just immediate self-refutation? I don't consider that anybody who is speaking and is using epistemic norms can go around parading and around saying that, well, no, moral norms are not allowed. Because what's the fundamental distinction between an epistemic norm and a moral norm? They're both saying what you should or shouldn't do. It doesn't seem that much of a leap that you can get from facts of reality to moral norms if you can get from facts of reality to epistemic norms.
Yeah, so I would say personally that epistemic norms are different from moral norms, because I take justification for epistemic norms to be external, whereas I take justification for moral norms to be internal. And I don't think that if you're trying to point to the external justification for moral norms, I think you're going to run into a circularity there, because you're going to have to already assume those principles to find them.
Well, I mean, it doesn't seem that I was doing that, though. I didn't start my spiel initially by saying, okay, let's assume that the first comer has the right to these things. I didn't say that. I showed that, well, first of all, it's required for humans beings to exist in the first place, to continue existing, that the first comer has to be, in principle, the one who has the right there. And to whatever extent that isn't the case, then human flourishing goes to the floor. I could explain that in more depth, of course, but that's outside the scope right now. And then I showed that, well, in fact, the latecomer, he's in contradiction in all sorts of different ways. He's a whim worshipper. He's assuming that his consciousness has primacy over existence. It doesn't strike me that at any point I had to assume that the NEP was true. Now, I think this does touch on the other point that I had noted down here, which is, now correct me if I'm wrong, your understanding of what like proper normativity for like objective normativity, what that would mean would be to go from a descriptive statement to some duty, which you say is some obligation on some party. Now I'm curious about what I think you're taking a certain view of what an obligation would be. Is it because you're saying it's got to be like external or something? Like, is this going to have to be like intrinsicist in some way, like an obligation from God, or an obligation from the chieftain, or an obligation from like some upper class or whatever? Like,
well, those would still be subjective obligations. So the only thing I'm claiming is that the obligation wouldn't be objective, but that still leaves open the possibility that it is subjective. And I say it's subjective because it's in relation to some motivation you have.
Like, what specifically would it look like? For because I think I am giving, I'll put the word obligation in scare quotes because obviously I'm an objectivist. I don't think I have duty ethics or anything. But like, what specifically would like an objective obligation look like to you?
To me, it would imply some external reasons, so some like aspect of reality that's not mind dependent.
Well, see, there you go. You're saying it's external, right? But what if there's a third option here between just being in the mind, just being out there? What if there's this third option, which is a relationship between your mind and your nature and how reality is? That's what objectivists mean by objective. What about that?
You would have to show that this is independent of your cognition, though.
Well, I'm not saying it's completely independent. I'm saying it's not. It isn't coming from. It's not born of my cognition. I didn't just wish these laws up, right? I'm saying that it might be, and this is the thing about stance independence or stance dependence earlier. When an objectivist is talking about stance dependence, sure, it might be stance dependently true that I should, go and study tomorrow because I've got a debate tomorrow with Haz. But that's only dependent upon the fact that I exist. If I didn't exist, then obviously this wouldn't be floating out in space or anything, right? So it might be stance dependently true, but it's also based upon my nature. It's not just based upon the things I think up in my head, right?
I guess what I'm asking is, can I look outside my window and see an obligation?
Let me ask this really quick too. I think this is really relevant. Is just you mentioned that when Hume makes his ought statements that he's not doing the same kind of thing that we are with the NAP, because of the fact that he's appealing to some sort of external thing, which you've defined as an aspect of reality that's mind independent. So there's two questions I'd like to ask you. One is, which one of ours are actually mind dependent, like the laws of logic, or are those, when we appeal to those, are we not appealing to something external? Or things like scarcity, is that not an aspect of reality that's mind independent? And then also, I'd like to know specifically, what are the things that he's appealing to which are themselves mind independent?
Yeah, so the thing I'm pointing to is the obligation. So that wouldn't be within any of the scarcity, the laws of thought, or that other people exist, those three criteria. Those I'm fine with conceding are objective because they're descriptive facts. Well, I'm saying you're not grounding in some external justification is the obligation itself.
So so help me understand how that is functionally valid with Hume. Show me, to help me understand, I'd like to know, what are the valid external forces that he is grounding his specific should statement in?
Well, so I from what I heard from Zulu, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems he's implying that Hume's doing some performative contradiction in claiming that there's epistemic normativity, and then claiming
contradiction.
Oh, okay.
That it's a contradiction, like just straight up. Like he's saying, it'd be like if I said, nobody should ever make any arguments, and that's my claim.
Gotcha,
I have an argument why nobody should ever make arguments.
Okay, so you're saying he's literally saying
that might be. Let's say no statement should ever reference the color blue.
Yeah, and you're saying he's literally claiming P and not P, basically, right?
Yeah, he's saying you should not believe in should statements. It's in essence.
Yeah. And we try to fix that problem by separating epistemic from moral normativity, right? And then your claim is that we can't actually make that distinction. Am I following the flow right?
Yeah, or at least I haven't seen like what would be the relevant difference there, because it's one is saying how you should orient your mind. The other would be, how should I orient my fist with respect to your face? Should I punch you or shouldn't I? Like, it doesn't seem entirely distinct there. It's about what choices you should make.
Yeah, and then I pointed to, well, it seems to me moral normativity comes from internalism, and epistemic normativity comes from externalism. Now, we don't necessarily prove that, but I think Hume, if he did take that stance, that would get him out of the contradiction.
So I
don't want to be, just for the sake of being
real quick, because I think I can elaborate on something else here. So, at least for the objectivist view, it wouldn't be that our epistemic norms are purely external in the way that you're perhaps suggesting or intimating, at least. It's not that these are like rules like beamed down upon us, like by reality or what have you. It's based on your nature and your means of perception. It's a relationship between your mind and reality. That's how we get to the epistemic norms as well as the moral norms. It's in this third category of objective as against intrinsic or subjective. We don't think that the laws of logic are, for instance, intrinsic. That would be the objectivist term for it. We don't think that it's like beamed down upon us, you must obey the laws of logic or anything like that. It's that just given your nature and the nature of the world, these are the rules you've got to follow if you're going to accurately represent the world.
I think what I'm kind of pointing to, though, is I'm saying when I make a claim about an epistemic normativity, my justification is going to be in reference to some external fact that I can discover. It seems to me when I'm talking about moral normativity, the should there is pointing to an internal motivation, so they're fundamentally different.
Yeah, so let me just say, you're like, and if I get this wrong, please just correct me, but the question I'm trying to ask is, you're saying Hume made an ought statement, and his ought statement was valid because it appealed to external things, and we're saying we're making an ought statement, and we're grounding it in the same way external things. Now, you've given us the criteria of being external things are aspects of reality that are mind independent. So either it's the case that we're actually like the things that we're developing and deriving our position from aren't mind independent, like the laws of thought and scarcity and stuff like that, or alternatively, Hume has something like that we're just completely missing and is necessary, maybe. But instead of like describing it, I just want to know like which one of our groundings is not external in the same way that Hume's is, that makes his valid, but ours falls short.
Okay, so here's the thing. I think Zulu made an excellent point when he said there might be a contradiction here if you take the two shoulds to be referencing the same thing. Like that, I agree with him. That would be a contradiction. But what I'm saying is, because he's making an epistemic should about a moral should, there's no contradiction there because it's not P and not P, it's P and not Q.
Okay, sorry, I hear what you're saying, but I just want to make sure that I get this question answered.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to clarify just so my position's very clear. Yeah.
Sure.
So
the question is, you got it?
Oh yeah, just repeat it just so I remember.
Sure. So what I understood that you said was Hume makes an ought statement, and his ought statement was an epistemic statement about moral statements. But when he says you ought to, it's objectively valid for him to do that. It's not he's not subjectively right when he presents his guillotine. He's objectively right when he presents his guillotine. And,
it's insofar as he's making a statement about an external thing. So he's a radical empiricist, right? So he's going to say everything comes from the senses. We can't observe these obligations through the senses, so we have no reason to believe in them. We can't derive them from any premises that are describing knowledge from the senses.
Sure, but insofar as he makes this ought statement, and it's objectively valid because of the fact it's grounded in external things.
He would avoid the contradiction. So it would be valid because if you're an empiricist, so within his framework, I'm not saying his framework's correct, but within his framework, it makes sense. It's not a contradiction.
Sure, I'm just asking, like from your point of view, I'm trying to understand what you're telling me here. You're saying that the guillotine, as he presents it, is an ought, and it's objectively valid.
I wouldn't say it's objectively valid. So from his perspective, it's avoiding the contradiction. Now, my take is that it's kind of irrelevant what he said. I can still use the guillotine argument without affirming his should statement. So it's kind of a red herring in that sense.
The guillotine itself is not a normative statement. It's not a not statement.
Well, I can make it a descriptive statement rather than a normative statement.
Okay, but regardless of
Because
whether or not you can,
I'm giving you a softer version of the guillotine, right? Because I'm saying we can't affirm objective moral truths from descriptive facts, which is a little softer than the Hume guillotine as presented by Zulu.
sure. Well, I'm not trying to necessarily even make a distinction here between like moral and other than moral statements or anything like that. I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding what you're telling me specifically regarding.
Yeah, I'm making two separate claims here. On one hand, I'm saying Hume actually avoids the contradiction if you assume his position, so he's internally consistent. And I'm making my second claim is that my version of the guillotine doesn't even rely on that statement by Hume because mine's a bit weaker than his is.
Sure. Well, I don't really care about Hume in particular as a person or an authority either. I'm not trying to suggest that I'm attacking Hume in order to get to you. I'm only asking questions about Hume to make sure that I understand what you're saying. So there's this statement out there. I just won't mention Hume anymore. So there's this statement out here. It's the guillotine. It's your guillotine as you're sharing it with us. And the statement is this statement a prescriptive statement or is it not?
I would say it's descriptive. So when we talk about logical argumentation, especially deductive arguments, they're what we call tautological. So everything that's in the conclusion has to be contained in the premises. And if they're not contained in the premises, you didn't do a valid deduction. So when you're making a claim about descriptive statements that don't have the prescription already in them, your conclusion would be invalid if you added the prescriptivity.
Okay, so it's an objectively valid. So the guillotine that you're presenting is an objectively correct or valid or whatever word is
descriptive statement about the laws of thought and logic. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we've moved to a point in the discussion where what you said about external grounding is no longer relevant. But if I'm understanding correctly, why is it the case that the NAP can't, at the minimum, be a completely objectively valid descriptive statement in exactly the same way?
Well, I would still consider appeal to the laws of thought or logic as external justification. You're not appealing to your specific motivation, right?
That's right. External would be valid for it becoming objective. You said external was what we were aiming for.
External is necessary but not sufficient. But yeah, it is necessary.
Okay, what are we missing? What are we missing that the guillotine statement has?
So your premises don't contain the prescriptivity, but your conclusion does.
Okay, so and your guillotine doesn't solve that doesn't have that issue. If I'm
no, because my guillotine is just describing a logically valid deduction, so it's purely descriptive. There's no should there.
Right. So earlier when I asked you about the guillotine, I specifically said it's a prescriptive statement, and you said I could reconfigure the prescriptive statement into a descriptive statement. And since that point, we've only been talking about it as if it was descriptive. So if I take the NAP and I also reconfigure it so that it's a descriptive statement instead of a prescriptive statement, then would that not solve the problem?
As long as you're not claiming it's subjective or objectively prescriptive, or we have some objective obligation, I'd be fine. But I think Zulu is, so you conceded that to me, but I think Zulu still wants to say it's objective. So I guess that's what I'm looking for.
So I guess once I'm totally satisfied that me and you have got like to our agreement, then I can shut up for the rest of the call. I just want to make sure that I'm sort of getting there. So instead of, if I just don't phrase it as the NAP says that you should, rather, based on the laws of logic and scarcity, the NAP is an objectively true descriptive statement about actions that are, I don't even want to say recommended, like the relationship that some actions have with those presuppositions in the exact same way that the guillotine is saying is just a descriptive statement about how some things you say and do line up with it. I'm sorry, we're getting into the philosophy, so I'm trying not to be too vague.
Oh no, yeah, it's good. I think these are the best discussions, honestly. So I think that were your description accurate, it would be objective. I'm not gonna make a claim on that because I'm like not super prepared to do an argument against the NAP at this second. But my question was more tailored to this specific question: is the obligation objectively grounded?
Okay, well, let me just hand that over to Zulu then. But before I do, I just want to say, as a final question for me, is there anything on the screen here? I don't know if you can see the screen. Well, you're in here. You should be able to see it.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Is there anything in here that jumps out to you as, we're mentioning logic, scarcity. Is there anything here that you can see in this flow where it's not, where we're making an erroneous inference from how these ideas connect to each other?
Well, this flow is not like deductively valid, so I couldn't even make any claim about that.
All right, that's fair. Well, I don't want to go down too much of a detour after promising Zulu the floor again, so I will be quiet from here on out.
Sure. So, sorry, what was your name again?
Eratosis.
Eratosis. So, would you say that there's such a thing as a mind?
Yes.
Could you look at your window and see a mind?
You could look at a brain scan and find mapping from a correlation between mental activity and physical activity. So I guess in a metaphorical way, yeah.
Well, no, you're only seeing perhaps the effects of a mind, perhaps some evidence that the mind is connected to the brain. But really, what you're seeing there is neurons making certain chemical interactions. You're not seeing a mind, right?
You're not in a sense, because there's the noesis noematic distinction. So you can't make the action of thinking the object of thinking. So I think there would be problematic if you did. But we can create that correlation and observe it. So I don't see a problem in.
Well, so the problem
it's like
is
it's an a priori deduction. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't.
So my problem is that if your standard for, because the reason why you weren't liking my, quote unquote obligations given by the NEP, the reason why you weren't liking those is because you can't, look out your window and see them, right? But, you can't see like love, you can't see a thought, you can't see an argument, you can't even see seeing. But these are all things which exist in some sense.
Yeah, they exist. A lot of those exist subjectively. So I'm okay with saying that an obligation exists subjectively. It's only when you call it objective that I have an issue.
Well, no, it is objectively true that, I would love my wife, let's say. Now, it might be subjective in the sense that it's my evaluation of the wife. So
well, remember, I'm saying
true that my wife is to be loved necessarily. But
so
it is
remember,
objectively true that I'm feeling that emotion. But you can't see that.
So remember, I'm saying the justification is subjective. So the justification, you would be pointing to an internal motivation to justify your claim.
Like, would I just be purely using an internal motive to justify that there's such a thing as a mind?
So that I appealed to the correlation between the mental activity and the physical body.
How did you figure out that there is such a correlation in the first place?
Yeah, so if you do something to the brain at the same time, there's going to be a corresponding mental activity, so there's a correlation.
What if you were deceived by a demon, though?
Yeah, so we could take the radical skepticism approach and go all the way there, but I'm a contextualist about knowledge, so I would just avoid that.
Right, but I mean, you see my point, right? That
well,
you can't directly see a mind. There is no like mind substance that you can touch or anything.
Well, our justification for it is empirically derivable.
What about like seeing? Isn't that just a form of introspection?
You can't see seeing. This is why I'm talking about the noesis noematic distinction.
Is there such a thing as seeing?
Well, no, hold on real quick. Just let me make this point. So the noesis noematic distinction, I made it because you have two things. You have the objects of your thought, and you have thinking as an activity. What I'm saying is that you can't collapse that distinction and say thought is an object of thought, because thought is the activity. So seeing would fall under the same kind of distinction. You can't see a sight.
Right, but there is such a thing as seeing.
Yeah, you see things, but you don't see seeing.
Well, that wasn't your problem with my not that you couldn't see my obligations. You can't see seeing, but you accept
No,
that.
I'm not denying that you have these obligations. I'm just saying they're subjective. So if you had an external justification for these obligations, I would say that they're objective, but I don't think you have one from what I'm seeing.
Well, so would it be subjectively true that seeing is a thing?
It'd be subjective and objectively true, I guess.
Right, so there's an alternative. So, and in the sense that it's both, like, how does that work? Because you can't see it.
I can grant you that
the problem with the obligations was that you can't see them.
So
you are accepting that there is such a thing as seeing. So surely there is such a thing as these obligations, like, not just dreamt up in the mind. Like we didn't dream up in the mind that there's such a thing as seeing.
Yeah, so you keep changing my premise. So I'm saying that there's no objective grounding for the obligation, and you're changing that to these obligations don't exist. Those are different claims.
Is there an objective grounding that there is such a thing as seeing?
Yeah.
Okay, so why couldn't there be an objective grounding that the NAP is true?
I'm not saying there can't be. I'm just waiting for you to give it.
Well, no, but okay. So I'm just gonna run back the flow a little bit to see where we got off track. So I was asking, like, what the meaning of obligation you were looking for. Like, is it some obligation from God or whatever? You said, like, well, let me put it this: can I look at my window and see an obligation? I was presuming, well, if you couldn't see an obligation, then there's no mass, right? It's only going to be subjective at the very least, at the very most. Sorry. So, but that isn't the standard for seeing.
Well, we can justify seeing by pointing to some external criteria. And so, like, the objects of our thought correlate to some physical phenomena. So we have two forms of validation there. We can do an induction using some probability, right?
Okay, so then your problem with, why I'm not what. So then it couldn't be that I'm doing, some sort of improper normativity, or rather be engaged in some subjectivism, just because you can't go out there and see the NAP, right?
My claim isn't that you can't justify the prescriptivity objectively. I'm just waiting for you to do it.
Well, I think that I did do that, but then when we got into it, your assignment for what it would look like for me to have like proper objective norms is that you could go out your window and see that objective norm, but clearly that isn't the case for the act of seeing. Like, that's not your standard anymore. So, like, what is your true standard for what it would look like for me to give you an objective norm?
So you would have to give me a deductively valid syllogism that contains the prescriptivity in the premises, and then you get the prescriptivity in the conclusion. But you're trying to go from descriptive statements without prescriptivity to a conclusion that has prescriptivity, so you don't have a valid argument.
Hold on there, because what you're asking me for is that I have some, an argument with some premises which have like ought statements in there, and then a conclusion with an ought statement. But would that not then just say, like, oh, well, see, you're just being subjective, you're just assuming these ought statements, so that would be an objective.
Yeah, so you just discovered the problem, right? So either you're circular or you're invalid.
No, but then what is the invalidity with starting with descriptive statements and getting out an ought statement? What is that specific invalidity there?
So all logical arguments are tautologically valid. So nothing in the conclusion is not contained in the premise. So you would be committing logical fallacy if you were to insert something in the conclusion that's not contained in the premises.
Okay, so do you think that everything is, for instance, deductive? That it's just you've got these premises and then conclusions all the way back, and that's all knowledge? Or is there some place for induction?
There's place for induction, but I don't think that you have a inductive argument here either that takes us from some like observation to an obligation.
So would it be possible to induce? Now there are certain facts, and those facts have a certain implication upon you, given your nature, that you should act in a certain way.
I don't know how you would induce the should.
I mean, I feel like I gave that, right? This is a prerequisite for you to for survival, that this is the norm that is being followed. That was the inductive side with the, there is this thing called scarcity and so yada yada yada. And I went over like, well, what are the alternative should statements here? They're all contradictions. They all run into serious problems here.
So let me.
It doesn't strike me that I'm like, going off the wall. Like, where specifically am I like sneaking in some like bullshit in your view?
So can I just get some clarity real quick before I answer that? So are you saying that you're giving me an inductive argument? So you're taking some like observation about how people survive, and they do this through the NAP, and you're inducing that through like some statistical induction and saying that this is the best way to survive. And
well, so I was letting it slide before when you said statistical induction. But no, I don't think that induction is statistical. I don't think that it's that you're like, 99% sure of blah, 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 and then you're 99% sure of that, I don't think it's statistical.
Well, that's just one type of induction. So if you're doing a different type, that's fine. I'm just wondering what it is.
Sure. So I'm not well versed in the theory of induction. I'm going to be honest. I've got to read up more on it. But yeah, my view is that you can indeed induce these principles, and that
so under your view, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to get super in the weeds here. I think you're in an interesting spot here, but what would make a induction weak versus strong in your opinion? Like, what would be the criteria?
How specifically do you mean that?
So when we do theory of induction, right, we say that inductions that don't strongly justify their claim we call weak, and inductions that don't strongly justify the claim, or they do strongly justify the claim we call strong. So how would you distinguish between the weak versus the strong induction?
So I'm not entirely sure on what whether or not that's even a valid distinction between weak and strong. I would say if you have induced something, if you validly induced it, then it's just true. Like, I don't think there's like an almost true in epistemology.
You think inductions guarantee the truth of their conclusion?
Yeah, if they're validly performed.
Well, the validity is only applied to deductive arguments, but it doesn't apply to induction. Because validity is a formal concept, right? So validity is just going to say that the premises can't be true and the conclusion false. But with induction, that's not the case, because you're not making a argument based off a form. You don't have like a formal induction. This is why I'm saying the deductive arguments are tautological.
Okay, so I would disagree that I think that validation can indeed apply to induction. So I've pulled up the definition of validation that I accept.
Yeah. If we're doing a semantic issue, by the way, that's fine. If you're not meaning what I mean by valid, I just need clarity. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I believe I get this from OPAR. Validation is a broader concept than proof that refers to any process of establishing an idea's relationship to reality, whether it be deduction, induction, or perceptual self-evidence.
Okay, so you're using a broader sense than I am. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so I'm not trying to be pedantic here, so I'll grant that. Yeah, so how would you show that your induction establishes that connection?
So again, I would have to learn like the stuff I've learned on theory of induction. My apologies. I'm not up to scratch enough on theory of induction to recite it off road.
Yeah, so because that's just curious to me though, because you're saying you're inducing the NAP from this description that you're saying, but then you don't know how you're doing it. So I'm just
Well, in the same way that, if I'm crossing the street and I see a Jeep coming towards me at 90 miles per hour, I can go, oh shit, there's a Jeep there, without going like, actually, let's think about this and like reevaluate all of philosophy up to that point. Like, it's possible to know things without having an entire theory of induction, because I think nobody's had an entire theory of induction perhaps up until very recently.
So would you say it's like a seeming then?
I don't know. No, again,
intuition.
I do think that induction is valid. I think that the senses are valid. I can talk to you about why the senses are valid. I just don't have a full theory of induction to present you here.
What about
probably the most difficult problem in philosophy? Like, give me a break,
Well, yeah, this is why Hume denies induction's even
yeah.
a legitimate process. But yeah, I mean, I guess we can end there because that we can't. I'm not trying to force you to give me a whole theory of induction on live calls. So I think that's where we're at an impasse at that point. All right. Well, thank you guys for letting me on. I appreciated the conversation. It was really interesting. So thank you both.
Yeah, thanks so much for reaching out. We appreciate it. We hope to hear from you again. Absolutely. If you want to hit the same topic again from a different angle, if you got a different question, we'd love to get another call from you. So thanks so much for reaching out.
All right, have a great day, guys.
You too. Thanks so much.